Welcome to First Reading, the Old Testament Lectionary podcast for preachers and teachers. My name is Paul Essa. I'm a PhD student at Yale University in Hebrew Bible.
And I'm Rosie Candlethal, and I am a PhD candidate in Hebrew Bible at Emory University. I am also a Louisville Institute Teaching Fellow at Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. Our co-hosts, the Reverend Dr. Rachel Wren and Dr. Tim McNinch, are off this week, but we, friends, are here with you. It is a new year, and rightly so, we are beginning with a passage that embodies themes of new beginnings. We have preaching tips and insights for you for this Sunday, January 7th, 2024. Genesis 1 is our passage, with this very familiar account, Genesis 1 verses 1 through 5. And Paul, this is on you. So what do you want to say about this foundational text?
Yeah, what more can I say, Rosie, about a text that is overwhelmingly famous? Genesis 1, right? I sincerely have no other thoughts that I don't think is already out there, but I don't think that a refresher or a reminder would be a bad idea. So let's do some reminding at least. And I'm going to offer 5 points, 5 different things, and maybe offer a preaching tip and then a pitfall towards the end of the podcast today. So the first thing that I have to say is really small, but I think Genesis 1 and also Genesis 2, as we know, both of them are creation narratives,
Right.
right? They talk about the beginning of everything, right? The beginning of the world, the beginning of life, the beginning of existence, right? There is nothing before this text. It is the beginning of all text in the
Mm-hmm.
Bible, and it begins with the word
Right.
beginning, and it tells the story of the beginning of all things. So I am hoping that we can take a good breath
Mm.
here and celebrate the beginning of new things, using a text that begins a series of texts in a very large book called the Hebrew
Mm.
Bible, and celebrate the new year, right? 2024. Here we are, first Sunday,
Right.
you
There's that
know.
spirit of resetting, renewal that you're kind of setting here with Genesis 1.
Exactly what I mean. The second probably interesting thing for me is just the structure and the flow of the text, right? It begins with a circumstance when God began to create the world, or in the beginning, God created, right? It begins with that circumstance, setting the stage, and then moves on to
Mm.
chaos. There's formlessness and there's darkness and there's like chaotic winds. And then there is a resolution, which is caused by God's
Mm.
speech, right? Where God says, let there be light. I think that kind of like uh the flow of the narrative is like just so beautiful.
Right.
There is also the kind of things that are being created, right? There is the heavens and the earth at the beginning of one, and then there is darkness and light, and then the creating of evening and morning in verse 5. Just the foundational things, the sort of building blocks upon which everything emerges. So it's a just really catchy way of telling a story about a thing as important as the world, you
Right.
know?
Through images and through this like gorgeous, evocative depiction that you're kind of inviting us to renew our imagination around, right? So the beginning
Mhm.
of the world is material and it's light and it's these kind of basic elements that we can take
Mhm.
for granted, but are the signal of something fresh, of something that we are kind of listening with opened ears to.
Yeah, I like that. That's super beautiful. But another question, another thought that I had, which is really a question of like, who is doing the
Mm.
creation? In the English, it says God, which is what we all see and assume to be like God, as reflects in other passages, both in the New Testament and the Old
Mhm.
Testament. But in the Hebrew, we have Elohim, not Yahweh. Right? It's not the proper name of the Israelite God. It's Elohim. And as we know throughout the Hebrew Bible, Elohim is used for God. Indeed, I'm not denying that. But often than not, it also refers to non-Yahweh-like beings, like the other gods, like the gods of the Ammonites and the gods of all these other nations and things like that, right? So, what is Genesis doing here? Um, and I don't have any clear thoughts. I still think it is God doing the creation, but I feel like it's a little bit of a play on words. It's an invitation to a deeper study of who is doing the creation here. And so I thought maybe preachers like a wonderful word study of Elohim and Yahweh and the names of God and the person doing the creation in Genesis 1, or probably even throughout Genesis, will be just a wonderful intellectual exercise to pursue.
I love the way that you are reminding me again of the Elohim, the plural there, because it also
Mhm,
reminds me of
mhm.
the play that's happening in Genesis 1 and 2. And even as I think about Eve and her statement at the beginning of chapter 4, when she conceives, she
Yeah,
says, I have,
yeah,
I've acquired, I've created this man,
yeah.
with God, right? So, I mean, in
Yes,
that sense, you're kind of pointing to creation is not a solo project. But when we're
indeed.
talking about the cosmos, there is, a multiple power there, and even maybe an
Yeah,
invitation for us to consider our role in the worlds
yeah,
that we are creating and a part of. We are a part of the
yeah.
creation. So that's not just a one and done, right? The
Yep,
process of chapter one is what you're inviting me to kind of think about, and maybe my ongoing role in the new year in creating the
yeah,
world that I want to be in and I want to
indeed.
share with the people and beings that I've come to love.
Indeed, indeed. And I think part of the command that God gives to humans when he creates humans is like go and make creation happen, like
Yeah.
procreate and reproduce yourself and have
Mhm.
dominion and live in the world because I have made you in my image as the creator, right? Go and do likewise. So that's like a really deep emphasis on the collaborative project of creation. And I truly love that. The other idea that I had was something in verse 2, which is the earth was formless and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God hovered over the waters. Like the phrase wind from
Mhm.
God. It's not Ruach Adonai as we often see in, for example, prophetic literature, right? Or even in Deuteronomistic history. It is Ruach
Mm.
Elohim.
Mhm.
Again, the word Elohim shows up, right? And Ruach Elohim as a phrase, as a compound phrase, appears just about 7 times in the Hebrew Bible. And it functions pretty similarly to Ruach Adonai. For example, in Exodus 31, verse 3, there's a guy who is endowed with artistic
Mm.
ability and intelligence and knowledge to do all these sort of artistic work as part of the building of the
Mm.
temple, right? And the text says the Ruach Elohim filled him up so that he has this like artistic
Mm.
abilities to do the kinds of things that he
Mhm.
does, right? Numbers 24, which is a very, famous passage about Balaam and, you know, he been like paid to uh, pronounce an oracle of domination and a curse upon Israel. But the Ruach Elohim from God fills him up, and what he pronounces ends up being a blessing instead of instead of a curse. So this sort of like indwelling and coming upon of the Spirit of God, you know, repeats severally in First Samuel
Mm.
10, in Second Chronicles 15 and 24, performing actions and acts of God similar to the Ruach Adonai that we know. But it's just so interesting that it is not Ruach Adonai, but it's Ruach Elohim,
Mm.
right? Close to that is what exactly it means for the Ruach Elohim to hover over the water surface, like Rakaf, right? To
Mm.
hover, to move back and forth, for the purposes of creation. What exactly does that mean, right? What is it doing? And it's not clear, and there's so many interpretations out there. But knowing all that the Ruach Elohim, the Spirit of God or the wind of God, does in other passages that I've just outlined, I'm inclined to believing that this is certainly like an impactful, positive aspect of creation, like it's the ruach Elohim is involved in the process of creation, probably preparing the grounds for God's mighty speech, which comes in verse 3. It says, "Let there be
Mm.
light," and then boom, the light shows up, and creation begins the first day. Interesting thoughts, you know?
I just love the image that you're painting too, because I have seen the translation of Rachaf as brooding, kind of
Hmm.
but it's to me it evokes femininity. So like I think of a hen over its eggs, that kind of, but it's an
Yeah, I
active.
see that.
It's a warmth to the word too. Like there's a almost I
It
can
is
feel a warmth, a generativity, like but there's an
indeed.
active stillness, something that's like a, I don't know what, a waiting, but also like
Yeah,
a powerful waiting to me. So I think of even Rachaf with the thought of a woman's pregnancy, right? The quickening of the womb, that
yeah,
kind of, as a hovering of life. That's just sort of like
indeed.
there's a long period of waiting, and we don't know how long this Ruach Adonai, Ruach Elohim rather, is
Yeah,
hovering, as you say, but
yeah,
something is waiting, like we're sort of in the
yeah,
wings for what you've, and you
yes,
said the word of God now. The
yeah,
curtains are going to open up, and we're going to see light. Like, yeah, it's incredible.
yes. I just think of like incubation,
Yes, that's a great word, right?
Uh,
Yeah, incubation,
yeah,
brooding. Like, yeah, rachaf is just, it's just a, yeah, very evocative word.
very evocative word. Yeah. Two more thoughts before I go to my pit four is something about God's speech, right? In verse 3, God's speech directs the world, like, Prashit bara Elohim. God creates the world, but in 3, it's the speech, let there be light,
Mm.
right? And then there was light, and then the same sort of speech recurs in 6, and it recurs in 9, and it recurs in 11, same in 14 and 20 and 24, and throughout the entire passage, God is making the world or creating the world or baraing the world, right? But he's doing so with speech, with words, it's forming the world by the power of his words. And I think that for me underscores the power and beauty of God's, you know, character, both his omnipotence, but also his creativity, right? Ability to create and make things through speech. And I always wonder how well we consider our own speech. What do we say about our lives and about the world? Do we extend God's power and beauty, through our own speech? Or do we sort of destroy the beauty and power that God has made in our lives and in the world through our own speech, right? And I think this sort of thing leads me to my preaching tip. Probably
Mm-hmm.
the key thing that I wanna encourage preachers to think about closely here is sort of the juxtaposition between like formlessness and void and darkness in verse 2, and then light showing up in verse 3. And I don't know, but I feel like formlessness and darkness and void, uh, perhaps, it's very characteristic and descriptive of the world last year,
Mm.
right? Thinking about 2023, like I'm thinking here about political coups in Niger and Gabon, and Ukraine and Israel, Ukraine and Russia, and then there's also Israel and Hamas, and all the crises of migration and like homelessness across the world and all the chaos in the world. But I hope that like thinking about God creating beauty in the world through speech would encourage all of us preachers to form new beginnings this year through our
Mm.
speech, as beings who are created in the image of God, forming joy and calling for peace and hope and safety in a world that seems to be choking on
Oh
chaos.
wow. Yeah, choking on chaos. When you're inviting me also to think about the creative word, the generative possibility of word, as
Yeah,
many of our preachers are so invested in the craft of words, right? Of
yeah,
inspiring through speech right action in the
yeah,
world, right?
yeah,
That's to me the invitation that you're putting me toward And it is reminding me that on this date, January 7th, we talked about this, it's right after January 6th here in the United States, that has become a watershed moment, a reminder
Mm-hmm.
of the kind of
Mm-hmm.
chaos and disorder to which we are prone. And I think which requires certain kind of vigilance, as you're inviting us to think about the kind of
Indeed.
speech we
Indeed.
use, the actions we motivate through that speech, to take
Yes.
responsibility, and to
Yeah.
also remember that we share this power of speech with God, and
Indeed.
that, like God, we have the power to create and to destroy, and
Yeah.
that with some prayerful, thoughtful, deliberate resolution in the beginning of this year to set a deeper recognition of the kind of power that my words have.
That's right. That's right. That's right. I think of Paul here when he talks about like um words with grace, right? Words seasoned with grace, and speaking those kinds of words out there. It's a really powerful thing
Mm,
to do. And it works for like, those who are in church and out of church. Like positive speech is just a powerful thing to embody in your life throughout. But I have a pitfall.
good, let's hear it.
And, and the pitfall here is, it's really about like interpretation, right? How do we read the entirety of Genesis 1? Really, right? Is it the creation story, or is it a creation
Mm.
story? Um, and it's a really tough question to really like wrestle with. But who really knows how exactly the world came to be, right? And I know people have read this as like a revelation of God about the world, a revelation from God about how the world came to be. And I also know that the kind of tensions that this passage creates when we think of it in light of the scientific theory of evolution, or even worse, when we think of creation stories in Genesis, both one and two, uh, considering its ancient Near Eastern background, right? The sort of creation stories that exist out there in Mesopotamia and things like that, and the similarities between them, and how it makes people feel about that. And I don't want to get into the debates of all of that, but I guess what I'm saying here is that we should consider deeply what we mean when we read this as the creation
Mm.
story. And sometimes when we ask questions like this, people think, oh, yeah, you are pushing back on the ability of God to create. Can God really create the world? And I'm not saying that. For me, it is not a question about whether God can create the world. It is a question of the claim that the passage makes about how God created the world. And so that's what I want to push people to be sort of mindful of.
I think it's really helpful too to kind of put that into context, right? As people that teach the Old Testament Hebrew Bible, we put a lot of work
Mhm.
into showing how the creation story, a creation story that we see in Genesis, is in conversation and drawing from the inspiration of cultures all around, right? And so
That's right.
our own creation story, and now I think we're talking about both the ancient ones that we've grown up with, but also
Yep.
our own ongoing creations, as stories we tell about our families, the stories we tell about where we come from. All of these are
Mhm.
also creation stories. So, I mean, I think
They
what you're inviting
are.
me to is to remember that there are multiple stories even for where I come from and what my family
Yeah.
says we come from, right? So, to recognize that
Yes.
many of us narrate this story differently, and we may take
Yeah.
inspiration from the creation story, but that it doesn't have to hold dominion as the only one, or the final word on how creation unfolds, right? It continues.
Yeah.
So I appreciate
Yeah.
that so much. Thank you for the preaching points and for your deep insights into this foundational text. I know you thought you said you weren't going to say anything new, but I think I found fresh inspiration here. And friends, I think I can speak confidently that you may have as well. So that may be a good place to leave our listeners. Thank you for your work on this passage, Paul.
Amen on that. Amen on that.
Friends, we hope you also found something helpful in our discussion today. Remember that you can find an episode on just about every passage in the lectionary by using the search box on our website at firstreadingpodcast.com. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, and if you found us helpful, please leave us a review on Apple or Spotify or wherever you find us. Remember that our podcast is produced by Paul Essa, myself, Tim McNinch, and Rachel Wren. Until next time, I'm Rosie Candlethal.
And I am Paulissa. Have a wonderful New Year's week.